This was more vibes than plot. All right, my lovely people, you voted and picked the last tale of the Flower Bride for February's Book of the Month spoiler talk. I was super thrilled by the results of this poll. I think I made it very obvious in my Book of the Month selection video that I was stoked that this was available as an add-on. I have been dying to read this one, but that always makes me a little nervous because going into it, I have such high expectations for it. So here we go. I'll start with my overall thoughts first, and then we'll get into the spoilers. My main takeaway was that the big twist of the book was predictable, and the journey to get there was a little boring. It was a super slow burn book for me. I wasn't truly invested in the story until about the 60 to 70% mark. A big majority of the first half of the book I found to be just a big ol' snooze fest. But at the same time, I also didn't really understand what was going on. There wasn't much of a plot or something to follow. The book was just more kind of like ethereal, and it was just kind of a vibe. There were many mentions of fairy tales and mythology tales throughout the book, but in regards to the actual story, I couldn't tell what was real and what was fantasy. In the end, everything did tie together, but it was a bit of a weird road getting there. I almost feel like I need to reread to completely appreciate the book, because right now we're kind of sitting at like a 2.5 to like 3-ish stars for it. Like, it was fine. The writing style in the story was full of similes and also these implications, and it could be argued that it seemed like the author was trying too hard or that the writing was trying to be too pretentious, but it did kind of add to the atmosphere of the story. The sentences would be like elusive and they would create this like nice mystery. Just as an example, until Indigo, I was lost in that search, hidden in my own thoughts, but she saw something in me, something that turned her kiss into a knife that cut me free from the dark. So that's kind of an example of the writing style. She uses these types of sentences in paragraphs throughout the entire book. I definitely don't think that this storytelling style is for everyone. Even for me, I had to be in the mood to read the book. Like, sometimes I would be reading it and I would notice that my mind was just like drifting, and I'd have to be like, pay attention to what's happening. I struggle sometimes with this vague, like, pretty storytelling, like, method, because the majority of the time I just want the author to get to the point and tell me the story. So if you haven't read this one yet and you're thinking about reading it, I do highly recommend reading a sample of it before you buy it, just to see if the writing style will jive with you. So the main setup of the book is the bridegroom, which that's his name. He doesn't have a name through the book. He's just referred to as the bridegroom. So bridegroom is married to Indigo, who tells him not to dig into her past and they will live happily ever after. Well, her aunt, who she hasn't seen in 11 years, who she also refers to as Titi, is dying. So Indigo and bridegroom go to the House of Dreams, where she grew up, to say their last goodbyes. While they're there, there is this big mystery surrounding this person called Azure, and she's from Indigo's past. Bridegroom does some digging to try and find out Indigo's secrets. Now, the bridegroom is a professor, and he is searching for this, like, artifact that has a spell, because he believes that basically this will answer some questions that he has from his youth surrounding a brother that he remembers having, but everybody denies existing. And he believes the brother is in a magical land. Indigo is a wealthy heir, and her parents died when she was young, and she was raised by her aunt in the House of Dreams. Bridegroom contacts Indigo, sets up a meeting, because she has this item that he wants to see in her collection. They meet for drinks, they fuck, and she decides he is now hers. Indigo is very elusive, and I keep using that word as a descriptor because I cannot think of anything better. It fits the vibe of the story so well. Honestly, I'm not sure why Bridegroom agreed to marry Indigo. Right away, she came across as a little off, and like, for example, even at the wedding, they had no guests, like she wouldn't allow it, and she made the officiant and the trio of musicians who were there all wear blindfolds. Like, was this not a little concerning for Bridegroom? Then, 3 years into their marriage, Bridegroom still isn't allowed to know about Indigo, really, and she's super secretive, and I still don't really understand why they're married. It's indicated that they love each other, but I don't know why. Like, we didn't ever see these moments of love. The relationship is just very strange. Indigo is very off-putting, and then she announces that they are going to the House of Dreams because her aunt is dying. Then the story shifts a bit, and we learned Indigo had a best friend, Azure, who seems to be the main focus of her hidden past. Okay, so that is the main synopsis for the story. If you haven't read the book yet and you want to and you don't want anything spoiled, stop now, because now we're going to transition into the spoiler portion. In the beginning of the story, when Indigo and Bridegroom first go back to her hometown, someone she went to school with there mistakes her for Azure. Starting from chapter 7, the book starts telling from Azure's point of view, and we go into the past where the girls first met when they were 10. They became fast friends, and Indigo was always in like her own head and her own like little world when she was talking about like fairies and magic and things like that. And this kind of becomes like the main crux of their relationship. And throughout the book, when Indigo was talking about these things constantly, like it has the reader questioning, like, is the magic real? Or is this something that she like truly believes and is like real for her? Or is it just a game? Which, as the story progresses, we learn that Indigo is just a manipulator. She's very toxic and controlling of those around her, especially Azure. So in the Bridegroom's point of view, when he is at the house, it's very alluded to that Indigo may have done something to Azure. The Bridegroom speaks with the dying aunt alone, and she's super cryptic and is like, "How well do you know your bride?" Obviously, he doesn't know her that well. The first 3 years of their marriage, like, they barely talked because she's like, "Don't dig into my past." I hated her. And then TT tells Bridegroom that if he finds Azure for her, the house will reward him because the house also misses her. Throughout the story, we learn that the House of Dreams is like alive, and during the Bridegroom's time there, it shows him memories of his brother that I mentioned earlier, and it's assumed that if he helps find Azure, that the house will reward him and help him find his brother. Well, I found a lot of the Bridegroom's contribution to the story to be a bit pointless, and in the end, he discovers Indigo's secret, which we'll get to, but also he learns, or remembers really, that he did have a brother. No, the brother did not go to a magical land. You're not going to find him. When you were children, you were playing and he got stuck in a wardrobe without his inhaler and he died. So that's pretty much the Bridegroom section, his point of views all wrapped up. The whole time throughout the book, he's wanting to know Indigo's secret because he thinks that it will help him learn the secret about his brother. And then you just find out that, like, yeah, no, your brother died. Your family just pretended like he didn't exist because he died and they just didn't want to talk about it. And personally, I think that the brother aspect of the story was there to give the Bridegroom a reason to want to dig into Indigo's past because he wanted to also find out what happened to his brother. So therefore, the brother was like the only reason that the Bridegroom agreed to dig into Indigo's past. The more I keep like talking about this book, the more I'm like realizing just how much I didn't like it. I feel like maybe my 2.5 to 3-star rating at the very beginning is a little bit too generous. So I'm going to go through the most noteworthy things, in my opinion, from Azure's Azure's point of view. Her point of view was just full of the relationship dynamic between her and Indigo. Now, if you've seen my other spoiler talk videos, which if you haven't, go ahead and watch them and also subscribe to the channel. You do know that I typically go through a book by major plot points, like in chronological order, and talk about them. But with this book, there isn't much of a plot. It's more just kind of like example after example of Indigo being a shitty person throughout their childhood. And this is intermixed with the chapters of the bridegroom being like, I want to know her secrets. And like I said, I didn't find his passages to be very important. So we're gonna completely skip him, and we're just gonna go through the major things that happen from Azure's point of view, and then we'll get to the big reveal at the end. Azure basically grew up living in the House of Dreams with Indigo and Tati, which, by the way, I think I was calling her TT in the beginning. I'm pretty sure it's Tati. I'm terrible with names. Anyway, so Azure, she did have her own home with her mom and her mom's boyfriend, Jupiter, but she would only be there about once a week. Fucking Jupiter was a creepo sleazebag, and he was interested in Azure. And I absolutely hate when books do this. The like sexual interest implication from the man who also lives with the girl character. I hate it. It infuriates me. It grosses me out. And I hate having to read it in books. Anytime it comes up, like in this one, I'm just like, fuck. Well, now I'm going to hate this book. Thank you. Like, it immediately makes me want to stop reading a book. I can't stand it. It gives me the heebie-jeebies, and I hate it, hate it, hate it. But I kept reading, and in this book scenario, she wasn't really ever home very often, so the actual passages of him being creepy were limited, but they were still definitely there. So the years pass, and Indigo and Azure grow up together, and they're creepily close. And Indigo keeps telling her that they're of the same soul, but there's this very clear power imbalance there, and Azure will do anything to stay in Indigo's good graces. And Indigo is a manipulator throughout the entire story. She treats Tati like trash, and we see instances of Tati being almost afraid of Indigo and bending to her will. Throughout their childhood, from the ages of 13 to 17, they spend the majority of their time in the other world. And the most description we get of it is that it's this place, and Tati had a blacksmith make it for them, but it was all described in like these lush sentences that I couldn't quite figure out what the author was trying to say. I had a hard time figuring out if they were actually going somewhere else when they were spending their time in the other world, or if it was all just metaphorical. Throughout the book, Indigo would talk about the other world as a fact, and would say that her and Azure weren't from this mortal realm, and that once they turned 18, they would go to the other world for good. And while I was reading it, I was like, does Indigo know something that like none of us know? Like, is the fantasy aspect of the book real? Like, is this real, like, world building or not? And is Azure in on it, or is she just playing along to please Indigo? I don't really even have anything to compare it to. Like, I don't feel like I've read any other books like this. And so the whole time I was just like, I don't understand what is going on. So one of the most noteworthy things that happened was when the girls were teenagers, there was a classmate named Puck who wanted to be friends with them. And so we had this whole section regarding the several months when Indigo was allowing this other girl to spend time with them. But also during this time, we got to see how Indigo had fun controlling her and how it was all just a way to pass the time for her. Eventually, Indigo does grow bored of Puck, and there is one day where she tells her for her last test to be like a part of them, like a part of like their friend group or whatever, she has to go into the lake and stay under the water to wash the mortal slime off of her. Basically, Indigo and Azure are standing there watching her stay under the water, and Azure's like, she's gonna drown and we need to stop her. And Indigo's like, like she just doesn't care. And thankfully, like, Puck comes out of the water and she's like gasping for air. And Indigo's like, oh, you don't have what it takes, you know, and she dismisses her as their friend. And I was just so frustrated how much Azure still fawned over Indigo, even after knowing how she treated people and even how she treated Azure. I think the book did do a really good job of showing the extent of a toxic relationship. I did enjoy being able to read from Azure's point of view, everything that she was thinking, because as the reader, you're like, get away from this girl. But Azure is a young girl and they're supposed to be friends, and they just keep hanging out. So months after this situation happened with Puck, Puck goes up to Azure and she says this really great line, which I wish that Azure would have taken to heart earlier in the book. Puck walked over to me, stopping a few feet away, a pitying smile on her lips. There's so much more out there than Indigo. If you don't wise up, you're going to end up miserable and alone, she said. And I thought that was a really great line for capturing like the dynamic between Indigo and Azure. But still, Azure is still very dependent on Indigo. But at the same time, like, she does kind of start to have her own independent thoughts. She starts to kind of question Indigo and even mentions at one point to her that she doesn't believe that they're of the same soul. And this pretty much infuriates Indigo. So there's this point in the story where Indigo and Tati leave for 3 weeks. And during this time, Azure meets this boy named Lyric. And they spend time together. It's like this first little love thing. But then Indigo comes back from her trip early and she can't lose Azure to someone else. So she like sets up this like plan where Azure ends up walking in on Indigo and Lyric having sex. And it was just this whole weird thing, but it was also such a great example of Indigo just being super shitty. But then literally like she twists it to where like she's still not the bad guy, and she was just so manipulative. And that's just my thing with this book. It was just instance after instance of disliking Indigo more and more. And then we start nearing the climax of the book and fucking Indigo blinds Tati, which is like, I'm sorry, what? In the days following Tati's injury, I struggled to process the truth of it, to call it an accident, though it never sat right in my heart. I would find myself repeating everything the doctors had said. She worked late into the night. She was getting older. She was confused. She must have slipped and fallen in her studio, and a bottle of bleach fell into her eyes and blinded her. She must have hit her head for that skull fracture. She must have, for now she was concussed, so confused, and she would never be the same. What's wrong with Indigo? So literally, like, later you find out that, like, when Azure, like, found Tati, she saw someone running away in a white nightgown. Who else is gonna be in the house who has a white nightgown but Indigo? And it's like, Indigo's crazy. And we never get a good explanation of why Indigo would do that to Tati. And I guess besides the fact that, you know, Indigo is a psycho, and Tati obviously knows that she's a psycho too, and she tries to warn Azure. My eyes may be useless, but we both know that I am not the one who is blind, Tati said in a fierce whisper. Open your eyes. It's like, girl, run. So now we're at the main, like, climax of the story. Previously, when I was reading the book, to me, it just felt like pages and pages of this weird dynamic between Indigo and Azure. And I found myself confused when I was reading it, but also bored. Around the 80 to 100% mark, I remember looking at all of the remaining pages and just being like, oof, like, this book is not holding my attention very well. But it was also at this point in the book that I was like asking myself, like, why is so much of the story from Azure's point of view? Why are we droning on and on about their dynamic and their childhood? Just to learn that Azure was like killed off or something. And that's when it hit me. And I was like, oh, present day Indigo is Azure. That's why we're getting so much of Azure's point of view, because she's the main character of the book. So that's basically the big reveal that we're kind of leading up to now. So Azure decides that she wants to put off going to the other world when they turn 18. And instead, she's having her own independent thoughts. And she wants to go to college first. And can you imagine how Indigo feels about that? Not good. So one day, Indigo visits Azure at her house, which she thinks is weird because Indigo has never gone there before. And Indigo gives Azure a sedative, takes off all of her clothes, puts her in her mom and Jupiter's bed, and then we learn that Jupiter came home, saw her, started pleasuring himself, and Indigo was going to take pictures of the situation. But then Azure's mom came home and freaked out, and Indigo told Azure's mom that Jupiter and Azure have been sleeping together for a year. Dude, it was so fucked up. So I hated Indigo the whole time throughout the entire book. And the whole time I'm reading it, I'm like, why is the author having us hate basically like the main character? And then you kind of like put together like what happens at the end of the book. And then it makes sense why the author wanted us to hate Indigo so much because of what happens to her. So they threw a graduation party at the house. Partway through, Indigo is like, she tells Azure, I have a present for you in the other world, which, by the way, we finally got a description of what the outer world is when the bridegroom went there during his point of view. It's basically just a gated off garden. That's it. This book is so weird. So the girls go there, and Indigo, like the psycho she is, shows Azure a glass casket and is like, we could be together forever, Azure. And it's like, oh. So when you were talking throughout this entire book, from literally the age of like 10 to 18, when you're talking about leaving this mortal realm, you meant like dying. Oh, okay. So in a way that kind of ruins the fantasy of the book. And when I said at the beginning of the video, like, the book makes you question like what's real and what isn't. This is the main thing. It's like you've been questioning it throughout the entire book. Like, is there actually magic? Like is Indigo like correct? Like, are they actually like fairies or something? Like, is this real? But then you get to this ending point in the book, and then you're just kind of like, oh, no. Indigo this entire time has just been planning on doing this whole murder-suicide the whole time. It's so messed up. Indigo lunges at Azure with a knife, and then she ends up slipping and falling, and she falls into the casket, slams her head, and she's dead. And at this point, I felt nothing for her. The author made her this character that was so unlikable up until this point and I had already guessed that Azure was impersonating Indigo. So when you find out that Indigo has been dead this whole time, you're just like, oh, okay. Now, Azure goes and finds Tati, and since Tati is blind, Azure, also, side note, is wearing Indigo's perfume. So Tati assumes that Azure is Indigo, and she assumes that Azure is dead. And Tati's like, I'll keep your secret, but leave and never come back. And it's interesting because in the end of the book, Azure and Indigo both kind of got what they wanted. Indigo got to go to her other world by dying, and Azure basically gets to go and live her life, which she already wanted to do. She wanted to get away from Indigo and just go live her life. So kind of just works out. There are a couple of things that I didn't quite understand with the whole Azure assuming Indigo's life moving forward. First, right after Indigo dies and Azure is going back to the party, one of their classmates thinks that she is Indigo. But this is like the same classmate who at the beginning of the story, like 11 years later, mistook Indigo for Azure. And then when Azure goes and finds Tati and tells her what happens, did she not notice that her voice sounded different? Like, she just smelled Indigo's perfume and assumed she was Indigo. Azure didn't correct her. And I was just confused. Like, are we just like letting this like go for like storytelling sake? Or were they just like so similar that people just truly could not tell them apart. And to go along with that, throughout Azure's past point of view, she did seem like her character seemed different than Indigo. Like, I liked her character more, but then when we see her from the bridegroom's point of view, she's acting like how Indigo acted from Azure's point of view back in the day. And that's what made me dislike her so much in the bridegroom's point of view. So I guess when Indigo died and Azure became Indigo, did she really just like completely encompass who Indigo was? Like, she just like changed her personality and just completely started acting like Indigo to take over her life? I don't know. It was weird. So I don't know. I did not love this book. I thought it was fine. Ish. The more I talked about it throughout this video, the more I like realized like how much I disliked it. Like, there are still things that like I wish were better explained, or things that I feel like definitely didn't fit into the story. And by the time I was done reading it, I was just like, okay. Like, I just felt nothing. So yeah, this book was just kind of all over the place. I'm very curious. What did you think of it? Let me know in the comments below, because this was a weird one. As for always, thank you so much for spending your time with me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time. Bye!